Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Mencken. I'm the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today for our virtual programming series. Before we begin, I want to wish everyone, all of you out there, safety and well-being as we adapt to the new reality around coronavirus. While the Adam Smith Society has canceled or postponed many of our offline events, that doesn't mean we are postponing our important mission to promote discussion and debate around the benefits of free enterprise. So while many of you work from home and learn from home, we wanted to invite you to take a Smith Sock break each week for lively discussion around a variety of topics, including the broad implications of coronavirus. If you're not already a member of Smith Sock and would like to learn more, please visit us at adamsmithsociety.com. Joining us today is Mark Mills, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, to discuss the new oil supply wars and the future of oil and alternatives. Mark is also a visiting fellow at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science and a partner at an energy tech venture fund. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and many more, and he's been a guest on CNN, Fox, and just about every major network out there. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark P. Mills. Mark will give a 15 to 20-minute briefing followed by audience Q&A. Please note this conference is being recorded. Just a quick word on how to ask questions. You may ask questions in the question box in your GoToWebinar controls or by raising your hand to ask a question by audio to the entire group. To ask your question personally by audio, click the Raise Your Hand button, which is on your main GoToWebinar control just below your mute button. It looks like a hand with arrows indicating if your hand is up or down. If selected, we will connect you by audio into the video conference. When we invite you to ask your question, confirm that your audio control is green, meaning you are unmuted. Phones require your audio pin to ask a question out loud. Otherwise, please use the question box, which you can reveal by clicking the orange left arrow in the webinar controls. Please keep your questions and comments brief and state your name and chapter affiliation to ask a question. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. You don't have to wait until the end of Mark's opening briefing to ask a question. You can submit your question or raise your hand at any time. After the briefing, we'll get to Q&A. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mark. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thanks, Brad, and good afternoon, everybody. It's kind of chaotic times, and in fact, in every market, not just oil market, the truth or reality or perceptions of it on the ground seem to change daily. So some of you probably know about the president's tweet. I think it was less than an hour ago after his conversation with Saudi Arabia and Russia about oil. So let me start and try to paint you a very high-level picture of what I think the state of affairs looks like now, what the state of affairs is likely to look like in the coming months and years, and do it with just a very quick summary of the key facts and realities of both energy, oil, and alternative energy. Let's start with the obvious fact that the demand for oil has experienced a collapse that's epic in every way. There's never been as big a collapse in demand in oil in all of human history. There's never been as big a collapse in energy demand in all of recorded history. This graph shows a 12 million barrel per day collapse in demand. It may be 20 million barrels per day before we're finished. If you look back at 2008 in the global financial pandemic of the fiscal kind, oil demand went down about 6 million barrels per day. It gives you a sense of what's going on. Aviation alone, by the way, is 6 million barrels per day of demand that's evaporated. And that doesn't count the rest of the activity in the world's economies. Obviously, that has a relevance to price. And the other obvious feature that's happened that everyone doubtless has been reading about, it's front page news episodically, usually below the virus spreading news, is that the Saudis and the Russians both pledged to increase supply and, in fact, started increasing supply in the middle of the collapse in demand. And that, of course, collapsed prices further and took them into the teens. And in fact, in some corners of the market, oil is yesterday and for several days, it was negatively priced. The West Canadian crude was, I think, as low as -$5. In other words, you have to pay to have it hauled away. Prices jumped 25% in the last hour, up to almost the stratosphere of $25 a barrel, which seems crazy. We'll see whether or not, in fact, there's a production cutback on the part of Putin and the prince, Trump seems to think there will be, that will certainly keep prices from going into the teens and lower, but it's not going to keep prices from staying low for a very long time. So let me talk about what it means if we are now in a world where oil is going to stay cheap for a long time. And by cheap, no one knows how cheap or for how long, but roughly speaking, if you look at scenarios for where oil prices go, it's driven almost entirely by demand. Now, it's always been about both demand and supply, but now it's all about demand. It will be about the supply in the future, which I'll get to, but it's all about demand right now. If we go into a prolonged recession, demand stays low, maybe not as low as the catastrophic levels now. Prices could stay in the teens and 20s for certainly a year. If we get some, what this modeler called reconciliation, some modest recovery, prices rebound into the 30s. And of course, the rebound model where there's closer to a narrow U or a V-shaped recovery, oil prices come back up sooner and faster. If I had to guess, we're probably in the middle of those ranges, but no one knows because we don't know very much about how much demand destruction is going on. We do know something about the supply destruction. This slide is a certain irony in this. This was a study done by the International Energy Agency. It was released at the end of last year in January. And the quote that they have is kind of ironic. You can read it yourself. They couldn't think of any plausible scenario that would cause a fall in demand different than what was underway in their best wishes to displace oil and gas with alternatives. So let's ignore the demand part of the curve. That's the top line you're looking at for oil and gas. And by the way, that demand curve showing oil demand peaking was what they call their sustainable development scenario they did not believe could happen or would happen. And it hasn't happened so far. But set aside that's the demand side. Focus instead on the supply curve and on the part of the supply curve that they labeled no investment. That's the very bottom line of both graphs. This is the supply of oil to the world from the existing wells without new investment in drilling new wells anywhere in the world. You'll notice something that's important that may be obvious to everybody is that you have to keep drilling to keep producing. This is true globally. There's a decline curve for oil, and you'll see that the decline curve with no investment is rather rapid. So the world's investment in drilling has collapsed as well. It's already down in the United States, probably 30 to 40%, or probably go down, well, at least 50%. If I were, again, guessing today, it's probably going to go down 80%. And I think globally we'll see a similar pullback at these prices in investment in new drilling. So this is the other half of the equation with respect to future oil prices is even as much as there has been a huge demand destruction, the reduction in investment in new drilling is also a supply destruction. So let's look at how that's balanced out in the United States in the last 15 years. This is a graph that normalizes two features of a U.S. oil industry: total employment in oil and gas. This is the direct employment, by the way, not indirect employment. And the other red line is the total production of oil and gas in the domestic United States. You'll see that with the advent of the hydraulic fracturing industry in the mid-2000s, that production started rising, and along with it, employment. So essentially, you got more production, and you hired more people, and you got more production, and you have more drilling. And that relationship broke when the prices collapsed in 2014. Employment collapsed, as you can see, it's almost in half. But production only relaxed a little bit and then started coming back up. We had a disconnect in that time period. The last 7 years or 8 years, the United States production of oil and gas has increased as much as in the previous period, but with less than 1/4 as much increase in employment. Or put differently, the efficiency or the productivity of production increased dramatically with far fewer people. That relationship is the key to the future of shale, because going forward, the only way production is going to increase at the kinds of levels of price destruction that have happened is with technology. So hence, data's in the oil. By oil, by technology, I don't just mean better drilling rigs, that too, but I mean specifically the analytics and software part of the oil and gas industry. So let's turn quickly to the question of what relevance this has to the grand transition to non-oil and gas, non-hydrocarbons that is purported to be going on because of investments in alternative energy. Just as a high-level roadmap for everybody to get their arms around, this graph tells you everything you need to know about the absence of the existence of anything resembling a transition in energy supply to the world. This shows you the share of world's energy that comes from renewables for the last 200 years. And you can see, everybody knows, it was mostly renewable 100 to 200 years ago. And the decline in the share in renewables, it was long, result of hydrocarbons, coal, oil, and gas, and then dropped to maybe 12% for the last 15 or 20 years. It started increasing. But what you'll see is that blue line, that's the extrapolation, is the increase in the share of world's energy from renewables that was already happening based on subsidies that were being spent by the world's economies. About $2 trillion a year being spent to avoid using oil and gas. The pink line would be the increase in the share of renewables that would have occurred if everybody did what they promised in the Paris Accord. For the record, every country but 2 is not doing what they promised in the Paris Accord. In other words, they all, by default, withdrew. None of them are coming close. The only 2 that are doing what they promised are Gambia and Morocco. So for $2 trillion a year for the last decade or so, the U.S. got the shaded blue line. And if we wanted to get to the pink line, and you were just doing this on a simplistic pro rata basis, we'd have to spend another $2 trillion a year to get the world to about 20% renewables by the year 2040 or so. You might imagine I don't think that's going to happen. So the oil and gas industry has been a player in the alternative energy space, partly as a response to ESG pressure, investor pressure, political pressure. And in fact, the oil and gas industry globally has been spending about $2 billion a year on renewable energy. That's just an IEA graph showing you where they're spending it. As the IEA pointed out, they were unhappy that the spending level was so low. It's only 1% of total CapEx. I would be happy to make the forecast that the spending level will go to 0, but we'll see. The IEA has been pushing the oil and gas industry, as many activists, to be more active in, quote, ESG solutions in the oil and gas business, which sort of comprises a set of things. Spending money on renewables, that's the top red arrow, the $2 billion a year that goes away. Efficiency improvements, I think there's going to be more of that personally, and dominantly by reducing the emissions of methane or flaring, burning methane. I think that will also go away as a motivation in the near future because it costs money, and money is going to be in short supply, perhaps obviously. I should also mention for those who think that it's an important issue from a climate change perspective, I'll just show you one graph. We're not going to talk a lot about climate change. I'm happy to talk in Q&A about climate change, but this is a graph that illustrates the relevance of methane compared to carbon dioxide as a global warming gas. The y-axis shows you the heat effect of methane and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in watts per square meter. As a benchmark, you know that the sun deposits about 1,000 watts per square meter on the surface of the Earth at high noon. You can see that even though methane per molecule absorbs and radiates more heat, more infrared radiation than CO2, the number of molecules are so few, so low compared to CO2, that their impact now and in the future is a tiny fraction of the modeled impact of carbon dioxide. Put differently, every dollar spent doing something with methane is like spending a dime on doing something about carbon dioxide. So I think methane goes away as an issue, personally. The other thing that will probably go away is this. This is the most recent data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, looking at global corporate spending. This is Google's, Amazon's, Walmart's. These are all the businesses, not utilities, purchasing or investing in wind and solar production to either virtue signal, if I'm to be unkind, or to make pledges to support green energy. The cumulative spending so far It's $100 billion. It's a fair amount of money, even in the world economy. For the record, that is roughly equal to about displacing about 0.3% of the world's electric generating capacity, and therefore less than 1/10% of the world's energy. So put differently, global corporate America, dominated by the tech industry and some of the other giants like Colgate, Palmolive, and Boeing and others, have spent $100 billion to get here. I think they're going to be hard pressed to do that again. And so far as the American utility industry, which has contracts locked in for wind and solar now, that's fine. The question on the table is, will we accelerate them? I think not. This graph illustrates the build rate required to achieve the Green New Deal goal, which is to replace 100% of hydrocarbons on the U.S. grid with wind, solar, and some hydro. What the graph shows you is in the blue and green and black lines is the maximum build rate of electric generating capacity for the three biggest grids in the world. And this is measured not in dollars, but watts per capita, hardware. And you can see that both China, Germany, and the United States, all three of them, have had a similar peak build rate. In order to replace U.S. hydrocarbons on the U.S. grid only with wind, solar, and hydro, we'd have to affect a build rate roughly 700% higher than any build rate that's ever occurred in the history of any country on electric grids. And even if we did that, it would replace roughly 6% of the world's carbon dioxide. I don't think this will happen. In any case, I think green stuff keeps happening. There'll be more electric cars in the world. One reality of increased use of battery powered cars is perhaps obvious. We'll build more batteries, more gigafactories. Some of that will continue because of the momentum in the system. We'll see how much. But a calibration point for those who care about environmental issues, a single car battery in a Tesla or equivalent weighs about 1,000 pounds. It requires about 500,000 pounds of materials to be mined, moved, and processed. The increased use of batteries for cars is one of the single largest increases in demand for mined materials that has occurred in the last century. The tons of materials mined has already increased. It will continue to increase if the proposed goals are attempted. Whether they will or not now, I think is an open question. I think they certainly slow down. Another factor that's sort of in the backdrop that will become more prominent in the future, it's already become clear in some communities in Europe and some in the United States, and I'm picking just on wind here, the same thing can be said about solar arrays. The scale of things that are being built now globally, utility generation of wind and solar, is astonishing and epic, astonishing in terms of the sheer number of tons of stuff. What most people don't know is that if we just look at the plastic blades for wind turbines only, these are made of non-recyclable plastics. The blades last at most 20 years. Wind turbines last about 20 years. Some may last less, some a few years longer. Then they have to be decommissioned, and the plastic is not recyclable. It has to be put in landfill. By roughly 2045, 2050, the world will generate more non-recyclable plastic trash from wind turbines than the total volume of all recycling, plastic recycling that's now done by the United States. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? You might have your own opinions on it, but it is a thing. A couple more quick fact points for you. The challenge going forward in this new economic environment post-corona, it will be that money will matter. One thing we already know is that the idea that green tech has reached grid parity is a myth and demonstrably not the case. It costs money, real money for consumers. It independent of subsidies, the indirect costs show up as the indirect costs of the economics and engineering that are undertaken to make grids operate properly, ultimately show up in the cost of electricity for consumers. There is essentially a one-to-one relationship between increasing wind and solar capacity per capita in countries. This is real European data from about 6 months ago, taken from the EU's files. So it's not made-up data or ancient data. You see a one-to-one correlation with increased penetration of wind and solar on grids and essentially a doubling of the residential cost of electricity. I think this will be very hard to justify in a price-constrained world for the next several years. In the middle of all this, we have the constant refrain that the technologies in the green world will keep getting better. They will. This is a good example of getting better. These are the trend lines for the improvements in the energy density, therefore the value of a battery in something like a car on a grid. And you could say that battery efficacy has essentially doubled, a little more than doubled in the last decade, which is quite remarkable for physical chemistry. But the line to your far left is the line of the rate of improvement of performance of things that follow Moore's law in the computing world. I show this simply because people are constantly saying silly things, because the word tech sounds like silicon, sounds like computing tech, that energy tech can follow the same kind of performance curves. They can't in the universe we live in. In any case, there will be more electric vehicles. I think far fewer than forecasts that were made 2 months ago. But the most optimistic forecast from 2 months ago had the world going from about 5 million EVs, which exist today, to about 400 million EVs in 15 years. If that still happens, and it could, it doesn't mean the end of oil. It basically eliminates 10% of oil demand at that time in the future. That's not nothing. We saw in the last month what 10% reduction in demand means if it happens quickly. But if it happens over a period of 15 years, it's essentially a sustained downward pressure on the price of oil, but it doesn't replace the need for oil. Finally, let me share a couple of other things to wrap up. This is the historic spending. This is from the Federal Reserve data, annual spending in these categories by U.S. businesses. We'll see what happens to these cost curves, these spending curves rather, in the next month. Obviously, there's going to be a tremendous decrease, particularly in equipment, like structures and transportation equipment has occurred in the financial collapse. You'll notice that there was lesser decline in information equipment spending and software spending. I suspect we'll see that echoed, but the curves will look uglier when we look back at them in another year. The point of this, however, is to note that as we came out of and went into recovery, the energy consuming and energy producing equipment trends continued upwards. Finally, let me make a point about the digital spillover effects. You probably have been reading a lot about how the online delivery has taken off. Doubtless all of you are in fact engaging in what I'm doing and everybody's doing. It's a lot more Amazon or FedEx and UPS delivery. That trend began roughly contemporaneous with one-click and Amazon, and everybody following in those footsteps. So the freight index, use of fuel, diesel fuel, and use of aviation for freight has taken off along with e-commerce, which has long-term implications for the demand for oil. It may even have very significant short-term implications for the demand for oil. We're already seeing increased consumption in the middle of all this of diesel, but a dramatic decrease in the consumption of gasoline. Finally, just in terms of where the world has gone and where it's likely to go in the future, this trend line shows you globally what people are buying to drive, cars or SUVs. And the graph, this is an IEA graph, kind of speaks for itself, but let me just note the obvious. The United States last year, 50%, more than 50% of all vehicles purchased, light duty vehicles, were SUVs. For the world, the share of vehicles that people purchased that were SUVs went from about 16% a decade ago to roughly 38% now. People like the convenience and comfort of SUVs. They use more fuel. They cost less than EVs by a lot. This trend we will return to this trend once we enter a recovery period. Obviously, right now, no one's buying any cars. This is the last slide, because a lot of what's going on in the world is relevant to issues around globalization and world trade. This is something that is directly relevant to the geopolitics of trade, which will continue to be important, may become more important. I show you this because most people have not focused on the fact that the United States is essentially not an export economy. have long been a fundamentally self-sufficient economy, for better or for worse. We like to trade, but in terms of net trade, the U.S. dependence on exports is roughly 10% of our GDP. For the United Kingdom, for many European nations, and particularly for China, the dependency on exports for their economy is much higher. So I'll stop there. Time for questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate that interesting briefing. At this time, I invite everyone to begin submitting their questions if you haven't already, and we'll get into our Q&A session. Mark, I'd like to kick things off here with the questions by asking, what are the implications of all this for coronavirus-related corporate financial assistance and the like that may be proposed for the next big spending bill?
Well, I think the first obvious thing is that the environmental community has made it clear, and this is not subtle, that they want the Green New Deal. I'm just paraphrasing it, but essentially the Green New Deal should be an integral part of an infrastructure bill. So spending in their worldview should be on wind and batteries and solar things. We're going to have an epic fight in the energy domains over that. I think that's a mistake because it means we're unproductively spending money, but I understand what their motivation is. I think that'll be one of the big battles. We will also have a lot of discussion about whether or not, we've already had some of this discussion, to prop up, if you like, the oil and gas industry. I think we have to be very careful there. I'm in the camp that believes that there are some things that should be done, but I think it should be a very light touch from the government. The industry has recovered before. If the playing field's relatively level, it will recover again. The qualifier made about the level playing field obviously has to do with oligarchs and monopolies in Russia and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mark. I would now like to ask a question coming from Tristan Wimmer from our Pit Cats chapter. What are the political implications for oil-dependent economies such as Russia, Kuwait, Angola, etc.? And to what extent would or should the United States step in to prop up oil-dependent allies in the Middle East?
Well, the implications are serious because, and I think the reason that, if it's true that President Trump was able to affect an outcome in his conversations with Putin and the Prince, and they're reducing production to not overflood the market and get prices back up, the only reason they would have agreed is that they were probably taken by surprise at the magnitude of the price destruction, and they can't afford that magnitude of price destruction. As I think the question implies, and doubtless the questioner knows, that Russia depends for roughly half of its GDP in oil and gas exports. Saudi Arabia, it's more like 90%. And so these oil and gas dependent export economies are hammered by these low prices. The best thing, I guess, you could say we could do is to encourage a competitive market, which is not one that's manipulated by what Harold Hamm called dumping into the markets, and the extent to which countries are in extremis. I would prefer us to engage in humanitarian aid and other forms of economic aid for the smaller oil-producing countries with respect to the specific things that they would need help on because of the damage done to their economy in this economic recession.
Thank you, Mark. We have another question coming in from Bo Stump. The question is, do you have any insight or anticipation of major technological or productivity gains in the renewable sector? The example of shale productivity gains in the last decade sparked the interest of the questioner.
That's a good question, because I think everything about the future of energy is dictated by, first, the productivity the technologies can bring to those energy sectors. Secondly, it has a lot to do with politics, because governments can, in the short term, put their finger on the scale and distort markets and distort pricing by giving, favors, benefits, or mandates to one form of energy over another. But it begins with the underlying technology, and the question can be answered this way. the amount of additional productivity that's possible in the oil and gas field through the application of technology, both materials technologies, but principally digital technologies, the potential gains there are far greater than any of the potential gains from new technologies in wind, solar, and other renewables. I say this not because I have a bias on it, but I'm talking about from a fundamental physics perspective. The underlying limits to the maximum amount of oil and gas we could get out of shale rock versus the amount of those molecules we get out today, we're roughly at 10% efficacy in the shale fields. Or put differently, technology could, in theory, increase the amount of oil and gas we get out of shale by tenfold. We've done a twofold gain in the last 6 years, and we could probably do another twofold again in the next 6 years. When it comes to wind, solar, and batteries, it is physically impossible to get tenfold gains. We can get gains that are roughly 20 to 30% in the underlying technology. The gap that exists between what we can do with oil shale and what is theoretically available is the 10-to-1 gap I told you. But when it comes to solar, for example, the typical solar array that's shipped to market operates at about a 26% efficiency if you're buying the very best, most high-performance solar cells. The maximum theoretical efficiency in the physics of photovoltaics is about 33%. So you can't double from 20. You could double when you're at 10% to get to 20. You could increase 50% to go from 20 to 25. But you can't go past the 33%. It's the physics limit. It's called the Shockley limit, which means that there's less headroom in the physics. By definition, then it doesn't matter what you do with the engineering, you can't beat the physics. So when I say these things, what typically happens is, well, we'll spend more money on it. We'll invest more. You can spend as much money as you want on it, but you can't change the physics. All you can do is get closer to the limit. And the bottom line is that the limits on productivity for shale are far, far further away than the limits of productivity for wind, solar, and batteries.
Thank you, Mark. Next question we have from Greg McNiff from the New York City chapter, who asks, power tends to be one of the most expensive components for the large cloud providers, such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google. With cheaper power costs, do you expect cloud computing growth to accelerate in the form of cheaper prices, driving more enterprise adoption? And could this be a significant driver for the digital economy?
That's a good question. Electricity is not cheaper, by the way, nationally. It's gone up in the United States. It should have gone down. In my opinion, it went up because we forced a lot of wind and solar on the grid. With cheap coal and cheap natural gas, average electric rates should have decreased. They didn't. But that being said, they didn't go up that much. And it's true, electricity is a major operational expense. It's not the dominant operational expense for data. It is a relevant one. In fact, it's one of the biggest OpEx costs, but the total costs for a data center are still dominated by the hardware, by the servers, and by other features. But depending on the data center, it can be as much as 20% of the total expense. So yes, of course, if you reduce the cost of electricity by, let's pick a hyperbolic number, by half, you could maybe knock 10% off the cost of running a data center. That'd be nice if you operate the data center. It's millions of dollars of free profit a year because it just flows to the bottom line anytime you reduce an input like that. But it's not materially relevant to the ability to accelerate the appetite for data. The principal driver in the reduction of the cost of getting bits to your phone or to your PC has been not the energy cost per se, but in the astonishing decrease in the amount of energy or materials you need per bit. So we've seen a roughly billion-fold decline in the energy needed to move a kilobit now compared to 25 or 30 years ago. You can make electricity almost any price you want when you get those kind of declines. So it's not driven primarily by electricity prices. It's a factor, but it's not the big driver. The big driver is the fact that we now have technology that is so much better. Let me give you the analogy this way. If data centers had computers that operated at the energy efficiency of computing in 1980, one smartphone would use as much electricity as the Empire State Building, and one data center would use all the electricity of Manhattan. So the electric efficiency of data has improved astonishingly, and it'll keep getting better. But that doesn't mean that consumption of electricity will go down for data. What it does is it just means that the processors have become so efficient and so valuable that the demand for using them actually grows faster than their efficiency improvements, which is what's happened for a half a century.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes to us from Kristen Russo from our UVA Darden chapter. Do you think that given that there are disagreements within OPEC and now the U.S. Is one of the biggest oil producers, that the latter can compensate the oil production cuts by continuing oil and shale production? Do you think there will be some kind of protectionism on foreign oil?
Oh boy, I hope not. The problem with tariffs and protection around oil is that oil is extremely fungible, so you don't end up with the outcomes you want. The last time this happened, we had the inverse problem when oil prices increased in '79 and caused a recession. So at that time, President Carter was the president, and the Congress with Carter implemented price controls on oil. So it's the inverse, but it's the same. The inverse being, in this case, we didn't have a collapse, we had an increase that caused the inverse problem. And the idea was that you should somehow not be able to sell your old oil for new prices. So we tried to track who had old oil, who had new oil. It was criminal. It was a criminal offense to sell old oil at new oil prices because the new oil price was artificial, created by market manipulation. I mean, you get the whole argument. It was a disaster in every possible respect, and it resulted in criminal prosecutions. It resulted in all kinds of mendacity. It eventually got thrown out when President Reagan was in the White House. But it was just a mess. The inverse of that would be to put tariffs on foreign oil to protect our oil fields. Let me make one suggestion that would be easier and a less damaging instrument. The extent to which the capital markets are critical to oil drilling, and they are, and if we wanted to help our oil industry survive a market manipulation in this downdraft, then we should look at ways for credit extension, not to protect. I mean, you see why I'm struggling with this. You want to perhaps do exactly what's been talked about for all kinds of debt instruments in this crisis, is that you have better terms, you stretch the terms out, you have looser terms, you just don't call the debt as fast or as soon. You leave the debt in place. But if you don't call it, you might avoid a lot of bankruptcies and destruction in the American oil industry.
Thank you again, Mark. Our next question is coming to us by George Stepanian from our Cornell chapter. While the U.S. is not an export-dependent economy,
Sorry, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I just said go big red, but I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
Okay, yes. While the U.S. is not an export-dependent economy, our supply chain is greatly China-dependent, as the current crisis has shown. What will be the implications going forward, and will the U.S. take measures to reduce such dependence on China?
Well, I think the U.S. doesn't have to necessarily. I would rather see the private sector do that. I suspect, if I were going to guess today, one of the new features in ESG analyses about governance going forward, and this will be done both by investors and looking at companies, but also by companies and the boards themselves. They'll all be looking at, not right this minute because this is just a crisis, but on the other side of the crisis, of what is our exposure as a business to supply chain disruption? What is it? What is our resilience plan so that next time this happens for a different reason? It could be a hot war instead of a viral war, or it could be a cyber war. So what would be your resilience plan? I think this will be driven by both investors and boards saying that we didn't know that this component was critical to us. It may have been a component or a chemical or device that constitutes 1% of the cost of operations, but it's only made in China or only made somewhere else. And the question won't be just focused on China. What if it's only made in Germany? What if it's This kind of supply chain resilience question is going to go to the top of the list. I think it can be resolved without eliminating trade. You just have to build in resilience. You have to have a backup source. You have to, whether it's domestic or somewhere else. I think more of it will be domestic. I think it's almost inconceivable that Congress won't pass some legislation on the other side of this that will bias supply chain production to U.S. manufacturing and U.S. chemical industries for chemical supplies. Most of the polymers that are in hospital masks, I think 80% of those polymers, the polymers, not the masks, are made in China. We can make them here. We got a lot of chemical industries. So we know why they're made there, but will we make none there in the future? I doubt it. Will we make less of it in the future? Yeah, likely. So I'm worried about the push to make sure only build here because there's a lot of different answers to the resilience. But that's if the SEC were going to look at this and issue a guidance, it would be this would be the new question. What is your supply chain resilience? By the way, I should mention the obvious that when it comes to energy supply, we have a very high level of resilience in terms of the absolute supply of our energy to the American economy. We're functionally energy independent. We do a lot of energy trading, but we produce 98% of all the energy we consume roughly now. That's not true for most nations. If we switch to a green economy, we will be switching from domestic supplies to foreign supplies for two reasons. Most of the hardware is manufactured in other countries. So you can say, well, we'll make it here. That takes time. Most of the materials you need, remember the graph I showed you, you need 500,000 pounds of materials per 1,000 pounds of batteries. Those materials, the nickel, the steel, the lithium, the cobalt, the manganese, the praseodymium, the dysprosium, all those things, they're all mined elsewhere, almost all of it. We have not increased the mining sector in the United States for 20 years. We've driven it out of the country by aggressive regulation. So if we want to have supply chain resilience to those minerals, we better learn to love mining again.
Thank you, Mark. And this will be our last question. This question comes to us from Camille Nichols from our Houston chapter. Mark, you mentioned that limited government support for the domestic oil and gas industry could be helpful to support the economic recovery of the industry. Could you expand upon what this would look like in your view, and what is the likelihood of such measures being enacted by this administration?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of horse trading, perhaps obviously, going on in the other side of this. We'll get through this. How ugly it is will depend on how long we stay locked down, shut off our economy. It's hard to imagine there won't be incentives for every manner of industry. So the oil industry's incentives, if I were king for the day, I would prefer to see incentives attached to the rollout of new technologies, mechanisms of which the kind of risks that are associated with implementing new techniques to be more productive can be reduced. There are a variety of ways to do that through tax instruments and through credits and accelerated depreciation. There's a variety of things one could do, because the essence of what we're going to need for a healthy oil industry in the future is going to be not on just throwing money at it. The money matters. I think, as I said earlier, shoring up the back end, which is the financial markets and the stability, and reducing risks of bankruptcy that are, if I can put it this way, there's sort of the well-deserved bankruptcy, which doesn't sound like a nice thing to say, businesses that just weren't well managed and over their skis. And then there's their unintended bankruptcies caused by disruptive effects of the nature of the capital markets. The extent to which we can minimize the latter is one tool. The other is, how do we get more technology into the oil fields? Because that has always been what's driven the oil and gas industry. It's been a technology-centric business for 120 years, and that's not going to change.
Thank you, Mark, and I'd like to thank everyone so much for joining us today. Tune in again next week, Thursday, April 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern, when we'll hear from economist Allison Schrager on the economics of risk and how companies respond to and plan for shocks. Check out our full programming lineup on the website on the screen here. I'd like to wish everyone continued health, safety, and well-being, and have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.